Imagine three of the most powerful men in the American auto industry, CEOs of multi-billion-dollar empires, humbly traveling 500 miles to Washington, D.C. in their own hybrid cars. Not out of nobility, but out of shame. A month earlier, they had made the same trip in a private jet, begging for billions in public money while burning thousands of dollars of fuel every hour of flight. The press had seized on it. Public opinion was outraged. Then, on that gray afternoon in 2008, they appeared as if in penance. Rick Wagoner of GM, Alan Mulally of Ford, and Bob Nardelli of Chrysler, each at the wheel of a vehicle that embodied fuel efficiency. It was a carefully rehearsed performance, and it was too late. "We're here because we made mistakes," Wagoner admitted on the Senate floor. Strong words, but too hollow to reverse what was already underway: the public humiliation of what was once the heart of American engineering. How did the Big Three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, get into this mess? How did companies that shaped not only the American economy, but the nation's very identity, find themselves on the brink of collapse? In reality, this isn't a sudden fall. It's a slow, quiet, and predictable denouement. A story of industrial arrogance, short-sighted decisions, and a systematic refusal to read the signs of the times. In the post-war decade, American cars were synonymous with power, speed, and freedom. Huge, noisy, fuel-guzzling muscle cars dominated the 1950s and 1960s, symbols of masculinity and progress. But this mechanical prestige began to fade when the U.S. government, under pressure from growing environmental concerns, took tough action. Laws requiring drastic emission reductions rendered these powerful, polluting cars obsolete within a few years. Mandatory seat belts, reinforced bumpers, and minimum safety and efficiency standards forced the industry to reinvent itself. For the American giants, this meant one thing: loss of control. And for the rest of the world, and especially for Japan, it meant opportunity. In 1958, an inconspicuous car, the Toyota Crown, arrived on the American market. It was the beginning of a larger adventure. Soon, Honda, Nissan, Mitsubishi, and Mazda followed suit, offering not just cars, but a radically different philosophy: smaller, more economical, more reliable vehicles, and, above all, better suited to the new reality of American consumers. Then came the 1970s, and with them, the shock that revealed the fragility of American industry: the oil crisis. Gas stations were running low, lines were endless, and prices were skyrocketing. Suddenly, no one wanted cars that guzzled gas endlessly. But General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, so attached to the past, simply didn't know how to react. Instead of reinventing themselves, they focused on pickup trucks and SUVs, which were even more fuel-hungry. It was as if they were betting that the world would reshape itself around them, that consumers would eventually return to their roots, even as the planet cried out for change. And what did the Japanese do? They dominated. In just 5 years, Japanese car exports to the United States tripled, exceeding 650,000 vehicles per year by 1980. Americans didn't just buy these cars, they admired them. For the first time, foreign products seemed more American in spirit than cars from Detroit. This could have been a turning point, a moment of reflection, reinvention, and humility. But the Big Three misread the signs. Instead of seeing efficiency and innovation as essential directions, they saw them as a threat to their way of doing business, and they protected themselves. Ironically, U.S. government policies also contributed to this blindness. Tax incentives for larger vehicles, reduced regulatory requirements for pickup, and a rigid union system made it more expensive to innovate or reduce production costs. While Japanese automakers established factories in the American South with non-unionized workforces, the Big Three remained trapped in an antiquated and increasingly unsustainable model. Imagine the paradox: an industry born of innovation, which revolutionized the 20th century with the assembly line and Fordism, now seemed incapable of achieving what had made it great: change. And all this at a time when change was a matter of survival. By the 2000s, the chasm was clear. The market no longer wanted the products Detroit insisted on promoting. The world no longer tolerated its ineffectiveness, and consumers no longer believed its promises. But another subtle, almost invisible detail would help plunge the industry into chaos. Cars were being bought with money that didn't even exist. Inflated mortgages financed not only homes, but also automobiles. In 2006, 24% of vehicles sold in the United States were paid for with home equity lines of credit. When the bubble burst, the homes were lost, and so were the cars. Suddenly, America's three largest automakers found themselves in dire straits. Plants idled, inventories stranded, employees abandoned. And, worst of all, an entire country was wondering if it even deserved to exist anymore. So, yes, in 2008, the three CEOs drove their hybrids to Washington. But these cars, the Chevrolet Malibu, the Ford Escape, the Chrysler Aspen, were more like cover stories than concrete projects. They were meant to pretend to understand, to listen. But the echoes of the bad decisions of previous years still resonated, and the question hanging in the air was inevitable. If these companies had ignored the obvious signs for so long, how could they be trusted now that they were asking for billions of dollars to continue existing? The answer, as you will see, will come neither from promises from Congress nor from the symbolic appearance of hybrid cars. It will come in the hardest way possible, through the pain of forced transformation. And this is where the story takes an even more surprising turn. Between the 1970s and the early 2000s, the United States went from being the country that taught the world how to make cars to needing help saving its own. And it wasn't for lack of technical capability, talent, or demand. In reality, while the world kept turning, Detroit was frozen in time. The price, as many Americans discovered, was steep. Jobs disappeared, cities withered, and brand confidence, once a source of pride, turned into quiet distrust. Consider the neighborhoods surrounding the former GM plants in Michigan. Entire families depended on the weekly paycheck that accompanied the constant whir of machinery. On cold winter mornings, parents left early, wearing heavy coats and carrying metal lunchboxes, hoping their work would secure their children's future. But that hope eroded year after year as production slowed. Cars sat at dealerships, and consumers began seeking out models with hard-to-pronounce names that promised more for less. Suddenly, the pride of having a Buick in the garage gave way to the convenience of owning a Toyota Corolla that never broke down. And when the mortgage crisis hit, taking jobs, housing, and stability with it, the auto industry found itself deeply involved in this economic knot. After all, most people could only finance a new car because they used their home as collateral. In 2006, nearly a quarter of U.S. auto sales came from mortgage-backed lines of credit, a veritable house of cards. And when the foundations gave way, everything collapsed. What seemed like a housing market problem quickly became a mobility problem. Literally, thousands of people lost their homes and cars, often in the same week. But it wasn't just a crisis of numbers. It was a crisis of identity. For many, especially in Midwestern cities, losing their car wasn't just about displacement. It was an emotional blow. It was the end of a symbol. The car that had taken their children to school, that had taken them on a family vacation that summer, that had marked the landing of their first job, was now towed, impounded, returned to the bank. The American dream on four wheels was being taken away en masse. And what did the Big Three do about it? Instead of admitting the strategic error of not investing in more affordable, high-performance cars, they doubled down on SUVs and trucks, vehicles that, while profitable, were increasingly incompatible with the new consumer reality. People in debt, unemployed, and worried about the future weren't looking for a $50,000 luxury vehicle that used as much fuel as a tractor. They wanted something simple, reliable, and economical. But that wasn't in the plans for old Detroit. Meanwhile, the Japanese were smiling. In 2006, Consumer Reports' 10 Best Cars ranking was composed entirely of Japanese models: Honda Civic, Toyota Camry, Subaru Outback. These names had entered the American mainstream, not because they were exotic, but because they were reliable, because they worked, because they met exactly what most people needed. And that said a lot about those who paid attention to the consumer, and those who were simply trying to survive by selling an outdated idea of success. For American automakers, the cost of resisting change was becoming unbearable. The burden of labor contracts, pensions, and lifetime health insurance was adding to the high cost of domestic production. While Japanese automakers were investing in robotics, strategic outsourcing, and local partnerships, the Big Three remained stuck in a model that had worked well in the 1980s. But in the 21st century, it was dead weight. And then the panic set in. Calls for government aid were accompanied by a public persuasion campaign. CEOs claimed that the collapse of the automakers would not just be a problem for Detroit, but an earthquake that would affect the entire American economy. Dealerships, suppliers, small repair shops, logistics networks, a domino effect, and there was a reason for that. But there was also fear. The fear of admitting that decades of bad decisions were rippling through the vested interest. The mood in Congress was tense. The initial bailout proposal had failed. Many senators were reluctant to hand out billions to companies that, until recently, had behaved as if they were untouchable. But pressure was mounting. Stocks were plummeting. Unemployment was rising. Then, in a controversial move, President George W. Bush decided to act without congressional approval. He approved a $17 billion emergency bailout, a temporary measure, with the promise of additional funding when Barack Obama took office. But this money wouldn't come without strings attached. Automakers had to change. They had to reinvent themselves. GM filed for bankruptcy and resurfaced with federal support. The old GM was transformed into Motors Liquidation Company, and its most valuable assets were sold to a new, leaner entity, the new General Motors. This new version of the company eliminated entire brands like Hummer, Saturn, and Pontiac, sold Saab, closed factories, and laid off a third of its employees and 35% of its managers. It was a radical cleanup, a painful reset. Chrysler followed a similar path. The company partnered with Fiat, focused on strong brands like Jeep, Dodge, and Ram, and began developing more capable sedans. Ford, which miraculously didn't need public money, was already shedding brands like Aston Martin, Land Rover, and Jaguar. Its efforts focused on more compact, less expensive models like the Fusion, Focus, and Fiesta. It seemed the Big Three were finally listening, that they had learned their lesson. But did they really do it? For a few years, optimism reigned. A sense of rebirth reigned. Production lines were given a new lease of life. Television spots showed smiling Americans driving modern, affordable, and fuel-efficient cars. The promise was clear: never again to repeat the mistakes of the past. But if there's one thing history teaches us, it's that industry promise, like the cars it makes, have an expiration date, and time was running out. Before examining how these promises led to another surprising turn of events, I invite you to consider: how many times have you trusted a brand, a name, only to discover later that it was just slick marketing? The story of American automakers is, at heart, the story of many of our choices: betrayed trust, quiet frustration, and the hope that, this time, things really can change. If you enjoy this investigation into the collapse and transformation of the American auto industry, please subscribe to our channel now. This allows us to continue bringing you in-depth, insightful, and surprising stories like this one, like us, so the algorithm knows this content is worth sharing. Share it with someone who also deserves to understand why even giants sometimes have to hit rock bottom before they wake up. And in the next part, get ready to discover why, even after all that, the Big Three kept making the same mistakes, and what that reveals about the real engine that still powers Detroit. What if I told you that, even after nearly imploding under the weight of their own choices, American automakers found themselves in the exact same place, where everything started to go wrong? Yes, after multi-billion-dollar bailouts, massive layoffs, the closure of historic brands, and solemn promises to reinvent themselves, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler simply turned around. Not only did they refocus their efforts on SUVs and trucks, but they virtually abandoned the idea of producing passenger cars in the United States. Models like the Fusion, Focus, Fiesta, Cruze, Dart all disappeared as if they had never existed. In 2018, Ford officially announced the end of production of all its passenger cars for the American market. with the exception of the Mustang. GM followed suit shortly after. Chrysler had already initiated this movement in 2016. But why? Why return to the economic model that sank them during the last crisis? Are they really that blind? Or is there a deeper reason for this decision? The answer begins with a space. Literally, in the 1970s, when the world was facing the first global energy crisis, the United States created the fuel economy standards known as Average Fuel Consumption of Companies, or CAFE. This legislation set fuel efficiency targets for passenger cars. There was, however, one exception: light trucks. Hoarders, this category included pickup trucks, SUVs, and vans, vehicles originally designed for heavy-duty work, not everyday urban use. And here's the curious detail. It was enough for a vehicle to have certain vague characteristics, such as being designed to carry goods or to roll horse route, to be classified as a light truck. The result? A large, comfortable SUV, like the Chevrolet Tahoe, could escape the strict fuel efficiency requirements that a smaller sedan like the Cruze would have to meet. Does this make sense to you? Because, for the industry, it was the case, and, repeatedly, it's the famous gap between SUV loophole, and it is through this wide-open door that American automakers have decided to return. After all, why invest in more efficient and affordable cars, which require years of research and development, if it is possible to produce larger vehicles with more lenient requirements, which can still be sold with much higher profit margins? But that's only half the story. There is another hidden element, even older, something called chicken tax. A retaliatory trade measure introduced in the 1960s imposed a 25% tariff on imported pickup trucks. This measure prevented foreign companies from competing on equal terms in the American pickup and SUV market. If Toyota wanted to sell a Hilux in the United States, it would have to manufacture it domestically or pay an absurd tax. Thus, without having to combine quality with competitive pricing, the Big Three gained a sort of protected territory to explore at their leisure. But to what extent can one hide behind legal loopholes? The answer may lie in the number of recalls. In 2024, GM, Ford, and Chrysler were the first, second, and fourth largest automakers in the United States, respectively, recalling vehicles for technical defects. Is this a coincidence or a symptom? Let's think together. What happens when a company realizes that it's more profitable to promote a seemingly robust product than to invest in true technical excellence? What happens when the priority is no longer the consumer, but the shareholder? The answer lies in dealership lots crammed with idle SUVs, in reports from owners of new vehicles whose engines explode within 60,000 miles, in investigations that stall until a government agency decides to intervene. One example? GM's L87 engine, a 6.2-liter used in models like the Suburban, Silverado, Escalade, and Yukon, began failing catastrophically. Complaints had been piling up since 2019. In 2025, after 6 years, after a long silence, the NHTSA finally intervened, forcing GM to recall more than 600,000 vehicles. Even more shocking, the engine had already been linked to more than 40 fires. But is it an accident or a trend? Because the same scenario is repeating itself on other fronts. Chrysler, for example, was implicated in an emissions scandal similar to Volkswagen. Vehicles that had passed laboratory tests but polluted much more on the streets. The result? Multi-billion-dollar fines, public apologies, and the revelation that part of the board knew about it and had covered it up. It is in this scenario that a new question arises. What if the real problem isn't technology, but corporate culture? A culture built on maximizing short-term profits, even if it means sacrificing trust, reputation, and, in some cases, safety. A culture that prioritizes layoffs, closing entire factories, and cutting operating costs to pay dividends to shareholders, as did Stellantis, Chrysler's new name after its merger with PSA. By 2023, Stellantis had achieved record profits of over $20 billion. The CEO pocketed $40 million of that. Meanwhile, factories were closing, workers were being laid off, and Dodge and Jeep cars were beginning to show visible signs of poor quality. Internally, Engineers were warning of defective parts and unrealistic delivery times. On the road, customers were beginning to notice that new cars weren't what they used to be. Perhaps the most disturbing point of this story is to realize that, despite all the scandals, failures, and controversial decisions, nothing has really changed. And therein lies the shock. In theory, the recession should have marked a turning point. Instead, it has merely reconfigured the rules of the game. The pieces have been moved, the names on the windows have been updated, but the logic remains the same. Sell as much as possible at the highest possible price, using any remaining legal, political, or cultural advantage. And now, a new revolution is knocking at the door: electric vehicles. But have these companies learned the lessons of the past? Or will they once again try to enter the market through a loophole rather than building a road? If this story sounds unbelievable or, sadly, familiar, now's the time to join our channel. Subscribe, like the video, and hit the bell. Every click helps us continue investigating stories that reveal the behind-the-scenes decisions that directly affect the lives of millions of people. Because the next part will reveal what happens when the past masquerades as the future, and why, even in the world of electric cars, Detroit still seems to be losing its way. Imagine for a moment that you walk into an American dealership in 2025. You see SUVs lined up like soldiers, big, heavy, aggressive, equipped with screens, all-wheel drive, and bearing names that evoke adventure: Expedition, Gladiator, Trailblazer, Renegade. But try finding a compact sedan that's economical and affordable. A Focus? A Cruise? A Dart? They've simply disappeared. They've been erased as if they never existed. And the strangest thing is, no one seems to wonder why. The comeback of the three SUV and truck giants has been as discreet as it has been effective, and, to some extent, as orchestrated as it has been inevitable. But what most people don't know is that this comeback isn't due to spontaneous demand, but rather a deliberate attempt at market repositioning, supported by ambiguous legislation, incisive marketing, and, above all, a game of interests that shapes the tastes of American consumers without their knowledge. In other words, you didn't ask for an SUV. Someone convinced you needed one. Let's look at this in numbers. In 2009, passenger cars accounted for about 50% of light vehicle sales in the United States. By 2024, that figure had dropped to just 20%. This means that 4 out of 5 vehicles sold in the United States today are SUVs or light trucks. That's nearly 80%. That's a dramatic shift in less than 2 decades. But why is this important? Because behind this phenomenon lies a trap with economic, environmental, and even social implications. Understanding this trap is fundamental to understanding not only the current state of the automotive industry, but also the future that is shaping up for all of us. The first element of this trap lies in legal classification. As mentioned earlier, SUVs and pickup trucks escape many fuel efficiency regulations because they are classified as light commercial vehicles. See Keith. This definition, created in the 1970s to protect the agricultural sector, now applies to a wide range of urban vehicles that have little or no connection to freight transport or rural work. Take the Jeep Grand Cherokee, for example. This vehicle has heated leather seats, a state-of-the-art infotainment system, and a starting price of over $45,000. Technically, it's a light-duty truck, so it's not subject to the same fuel consumption standards as a sedan. The same goes for the Ford Explorer, Chevrolet Suburban, and Dodge Durango, vehicles that have the soul of a passenger car, but the body of a truck when regulators require it. And that's just the beginning. Another crucial element of the trap is the marginal cost of production. Producing an SUV costs only 5 to 10% more than a sedan, but its selling price can be up to 40% higher. This translates into significantly higher profit margins for car manufacturers. And as if that weren't enough, these vehicles also benefit from chicken tax, which virtually prevents foreign competition in the pickup truck segment, thus protecting domestic manufacturers from fairer competition. To summarize so far, SUVs are more profitable, less regulated, and less competitive. The question remains, who is really in charge? The consumer or the industry? And then comes marketing. Over the past 20 years, American automakers have built a compelling narrative around SUVs. Advertising campaigns depict happy families driving through forests, braving storms, climbing mountains, and towing boats and trailers. SUVs have become symbols of freedom, safety, and power. Yet, 90% of SUV owners never leave the road and spend most of their time stuck in urban traffic. But the image was sold, and the public bought it. This brings us to the most unexpected point. Desire was fabricated. The idea that SUVs are safer, for example, is relative. Studies show that while SUV occupants are better protected in a head-on collision, these vehicles are more likely to roll over on curves and can cause more damage to pedestrians and smaller cars in the event of an accident. In other words, safety for the occupant, not necessarily for everyone else. Let's take a break. To summarize, car manufacturers returned to SUVs not because the market demanded it, but because the legal, economic, and cultural conditions were cleverly designed to make this choice not only possible, but irresistible. Margins are higher, competition is weaker, rules are more lenient, and marketing does the rest. Now ask yourself, what if this isn't sustainable? Behind the scenes, the consequences are already being felt. CO2 emissions per vehicle are rising again. The average weight of vehicles sold in the United States is higher than ever. Roads are more congested. Fuel consumption per kilometer has edged up, and repair, maintenance, and insurance costs are rising. But it doesn't stop there. The saturation of the SUV market has also created a new dilemma. Inventory is rising. By 2025, industry data shows that the average time to sell a new SUV will have increased by 20% compared to the previous year. In other words, they're stuck. Dealers are feeling the pressure. Manufacturers are multiplying incentives, promotions, and loyalty bonus, trying to stay the course. But signs of fatigue are everywhere. And there is yet another point of tension, often ignored: consumer debt. SUVs are more expensive, and to acquire them, many Americans are resorting to increasingly long financing terms, with monthly payments as long as 84 months. That's right, 7 years for a car that, in many cases, loses half its value in the first 3 months. Auto loan defaults increased by 26% between 2022 and 2024, a figure that should ring alarm bells, but remains a low-level statistic. So what does all this tell us? Automakers didn't just return to SUV, they went right back to them. In doing so, they left much of the American auto industry in a vulnerable position, trapped in a single business model, dependent on a fragile legal framework, artificial margins, and a consumer already showing signs of exhaustion. Ultimately, the greatest risk may not be technological or environmental, but strategic. By persisting down this path, the Big Three could repeat the same mistake, betting everything on a trend, ignoring the profound transformations to come. And as they do so, other automakers, like Tesla, Rivian, Hyundai, Kia, are watching, adapting, and innovating. We are, once again, at a turning point. If you've made it this far, it's because you sense something is wrong with this piece of equipment. So, I invite you to continue this journey with us. Like the video and share it with anyone who feels like they're being forced to make choices that seem right for them, but aren't. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe now. That way, be sure not to miss the next episode, where we'll reveal how the Big Three are trying to reinvent themselves in the electric vehicle sector, and why, once again, they're too late. For more than a century, the American auto industry has mirrored the nation itself: ambitious, powerful, creative, and imperfect. And like the United States, it has experienced moments of glory and collapse, innovation and stagnation, promise and frustration. The Big Three, General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler, were much more than just car makers. They shaped cities, defined lifestyles, and built identities. But over time, they forgot one essential point: a legacy can only be preserved if it is willing to evolve courageously. Today, when we look back on this recent past, the legislative loopholes, the souped-up SUVs, the emissions scandals, the faulty engines, the massive recalls, what we see isn't just corporate failure. It's a distorted reflection of a mindset that still persists. The idea that you can succeed without changing, that immediate profits are worth spending, that marketing can always mask reality. But what now? What remains? The big three are still standing, but the ground beneath their feet is no longer the same. We are experiencing perhaps the biggest transformation of the auto industry since Henry Ford's Model T. The era of electric vehicles is no longer a distant promise. It is here, quietly accelerating across the globe. And unlike previous revolutions, this one is being driven by outsiders. Tesla, with its obsession with efficiency and range, has quickly risen to the top of the chain. Rivian, still young, is already seen as the new standard for electric trucks and SUVs. Hyundai and Kia have entered the market with force, offering quality, affordability, and innovation. Even traditionally conservative Honda is preparing to launch its electric models with unusual aggressiveness. E-com Big Three? They're trying. GM and Ford ranked second and third in the U.S. electric vehicle market in 2023 with 5.7% and 5.4% respectively. But let's be honest, that's still small progress compared to the challenge they face. These companies are still stuck with outdated structures, outdated factories, and business models designed for another era. They need to modernize everything: their production lines, their distribution networks, their mindsets, and they continue to face the distrust of consumers who have already been deceived. Would you entrust your future to someone who has repeatedly failed to listen to you? To complicate matters further, what was once an advantage, domination in the SUV and pickup truck category, is now eroding. By 2024, the best-selling car in the United States was no longer the legendary Ford F-150. For the first time in decades, that position was held by a Toyota model, the RAV4, a lightweight, efficient, American-made, reliable, and versatile SUV. At the heart of the big three, a Japanese car won. And it wasn't by chance, it was by merit. And here's the great irony. The same automakers that abandoned passenger cars to focus on SUVs are now also losing their dominance in that segment. They're caught between a past they insist on repeating and a future they ignore. Meanwhile, their competitors forge ahead without asking permission. What we are witnessing is more than a market crisis. It is an identity crisis. And perhaps the most important question is not what will happen to GM, Ford, or Chrysler, but rather, what do we learn from all this? We've learned that it's not enough to be excellent, that tradition without adaptation becomes a burden, that protecting what worked in the past can blind us to what's wrong in the present, that the consumer can be fooled once, twice, or even 3 times, but not forever. We've learned that trust is like an engine. If poorly maintained, it eventually stops. And starting over can be painful, if not impossible. Perhaps you've experienced this personally. Perhaps you bought a car thinking it was an investment, only to discover it was a problem in disguise. Perhaps you know someone who worked in a factory that shut down overnight, while the profits went directly into the pockets of millionaire executives. Perhaps, like millions of Americans, you wonder why it's still so difficult to find a reliable, affordable, and honest car. If you've made it this far, it's because you believe that information is power, and that only by understanding the past can we make better choices for the present. This video isn't just about cars. It's about decisions, their consequences, and the power each consumer has to affect real change. So, if this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel now. Like this video if it changed your mind. And most importantly, share it with someone who deserves to know what's really going on behind the wheel of American car manufacturers. The more people are informed, the harder it will be to continue hiding the truth behind advertising campaigns. Thank you so much for following us. Your presence and time allow us to continue producing content like this, in-depth, critical, and true to the truth. And I'm telling you right now, in the next video, we'll explore the emergence of a new generation of car manufacturers that are breaking all the rules of the traditional industry, and how they may indeed redefine what it means to drive in the 21st century. See you soon. See you next time.